this is an example article presentation, and this is not going to be 15 minutes of the information, but I'm going to show you the basic formatting to consider as you put your presentation together. And this could be used as a template. So the first thing is slide number 1 is your title slide, and it has your title, which is, this article is looking at exercise and the risk of diabetes in older men. On the left hand side is the APA 7th edition citation, and you'll notice the format later that it's indented, and that there's also a DOI at the end of the citation, and it is not an active or hot link, so the hyperlink has been removed. Now let's see here. So you can have, today I'm going to talk about the role of exercise and the risk of diabetes. I'm going to talk about exercise and multiple sclerosis. I'm going to talk about resistance training and Parkinson's disease. So you're giving just a basic introduction of what your presentation is going to be about. The second slide should be the basis of the study. You'll see I just have basic bullets. I would verbally explain why the authors wanted to do this study, and notice that there is a citation at the bottom. It's just called an in-text citation. I'll go over that at the tail end, but because there are more than 3 or more authors, the format is first author et al. Dot comma and then the year, both in parentheses. So I just consistently put it in that bottom left hand corner when appropriate. If there's a picture, you want to give a link to where you found that, and it can be hot or not hot, doesn't matter. Okay? So this background and purpose is that glucose metabolism improves after regular aerobic exercise, after resistance exercise. So the authors wanted to know, well, what if you combined? And then you have an article methods. And I always think about that as a recipe. So sometimes the article has a flow chart and explains how the process was done to get to it might be a timeline, it might be a flow chart. This particular one didn't, so I just put it together. These folks had all of the participants, there were 19 of them. They had performed 6 months of aerobic exercise, which is AEX. They had increased their intensity, so they got to a point where they were exercising 2 days a week for 45 minutes per day at more than 70% heart rate reserve, and then they had 1 day per week of nutrition and stress management. After that 6 months, they were invited to continue. Individuals volunteered to be in the aerobic exercise plus resistance training, so they weren't randomly assigned, they volunteered to do the resistance training. So both groups did the same aerobic exercise. The only difference is the addition of 2 sets at 15 reps of some strength training exercises at 80% the 1 RM. We always want to identify what was measured, and so on this slide I've just identified briefly that body composition, oxygen consumption, strength, and glucose metabolism was evaluated through a 3-hour oral glucose tolerance test. And that is when you take a big slug, you're fasted, you take a big slug of very sweet, high sugar beverage, and the blood glucose level is measured at specific times after the glucose consumption. In this case, there were a couple other measurements. There was also the insulin. This oral glucose tolerance test had a few more measurements associated with it. So here's a slide where you want to have all of the demographics, and that would be your age, your weight, and sometimes body mass index is provided. The authors decided to put the body fat, the waist-to-hip ratio, and the VO2 in this particular slide. So the first two columns are the aerobic exercise only. The second set of two columns is the resistance and aerobic exercise. And you'll see that you have a difference pre and post. Recall that both groups have already been training for 6 months, and so they have a comparable VO2. The only difference is that pre-post, the resistance and aerobic exercise group had an improvement, a significant change in VO2 max, and you'll see that it actually went down, right? So they went from 2.7 to 2.4 if it's liters per minute, 31 to 28, and it's significant in only 7 participants. So there was an impairment of maintaining, but both groups did have a little bit of a change. It was only significant in the aerobic and resistance exercise. We also have to show the glucose information because this was about risk for diabetes. And so the individuals had, in this particular slide, we want to make sure that we have the data of the oral glucose tolerance test. And so in this case, they just had the glucose area under the curve. So basically, it's time versus glucose level, and then you calculate the area underneath that hill or that mountain. Initially, the blood glucose goes up very quickly, and then as insulin is secreted, it will go down. So what you should see is a change in glucose increase and then a decrease. That is your glucose area. We'll see that there was no difference in fasting values of glucose and insulin, either due to exercise or between the groups. But we do have a change in this HOMAIR, and that's homeostatic model assessment for insulin resistance. And this assesses the beta cell function, or in other words, insulin resistance. And for us to understand what that means, it's important to have, what does that value mean? What's normal? And so here we have a group of individuals that had basically, if your value is greater than 2.9, you have significantly likely to have insulin resistance. And that would be like pre-diabetes. So the aerobic folks didn't improve, wasn't significant though, but the aerobic and resistance exercise group actually had an improvement, or their insulin resistance improved, which is pretty interesting. We see that the insulin area is also improved. So you have less insulin that was secreted and better response to that insulin. So their insulin resistance by adding aerobic or adding resistance exercise was improved, which is pretty incredible. And here I thought this is not from the article, but this gives you what the insulin curve and the glucose curve should look like. So the insulin sensitive subgroup of normal glucose tolerance is the dashed blue line, and so that tells you what a normal response would be. So at 30 minutes after taking that big dose of glucose, insulin should increase. It stays relatively stable for another 30 minutes, and then it starts declining. You'll see that on the glucose, at from 0 to 30, if we look at that blue dashed line, that if you take a big dose of simple glucose beverage, it dumps into your bloodstream very quickly, and it starts, as insulin increased, it starts clearing from the bloodstream, and then within 2 hours, you're back to your regular value. So here you have a normal insulin curve and a normal glucose curve. If we look at the impaired fasting, which is the green, you'll see that even though everyone started with a relatively, well, let's look at the glucose, the green value, they start with relatively this a slightly larger, higher millimole of glucose. The green, it goes up higher, and it slows, and it moves down, and it is just a much higher value. So it's kind of a glucose is too high, and you'll see that you have this really big insulin burst with that group. The big problems are the impaired glucose tolerance, which is purple, and you'll see that when somebody has impaired glucose tolerance, you have to throw out a lot of insulin, and it keeps rising up to 120 minutes. But your glucose level is rising, and it's still rising at 60 minutes, and then it starts going down because you've got this massive amount of insulin that's been secreted by the beta cells. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that we have an improved glucose control if you add the resistance training to the aerobic exercise, and you have a better insulin or less insulin that's being secreted, which is going to be an indicator that your cells are sensitive to insulin, allowing for that glucose to clear. Now, I've used something called a snipping tool, and the snipping tool gives you an option of, once you have your article down, you can select an area and it copies it, and then you can put it right in your document, and it's awesome. So I'm going to suggest to you that you do some looking at a snipping tool. You also want to have a conclusion or results. Basically, the conclusion of the authors was that aerobic exercise maintenance program, everything stays positive, but when you add the resistance training, that's when you have the improved insulin response, but at a cost of a decreased VO2 max. So it's suggestive of adding resistance exercise to this population of older males with relatively low VO2, that it might prevent type 2 diabetes. So that gives you kind of an application. If you have obese older males, some resistance training is going to be beneficial. So how did I get this article? Well, you have to get the article to be able to get any of these pictures. And so if you use Google Scholar, this is what you're going to get. And here's the article, and if I selected this semanticscholars.org, this is what I get. It ends up going to the journal article, and this is very common where students will say, well, I don't have $24.95 to buy this article. Well, you don't need to buy the article. So what this particular slide tells you is it has the DOI, it has restricted access, and so the next thing to do would be to go to e-learning or go to the library page. And under e-learning in our class, there is a tab under content that says library resources. The library resources has a generic library website, which is the second one, or library subject specific resources for your course. When you click on that, you can find the journal relatively easy, and it's very possible that we have access to it through our library. And so what I did is in the library search, I just typed in the title of that journal article and asked for it to search. And I clicked on the green, what's that called? Magnifying glass. And this is what came up. One thing that you want to make sure is that it says that it's peer reviewed, and this is also a study. So here it is underlining exactly what I wrote in that bar, and then it's underlining it in the some of the quotations. It tells you that you can download this PDF, and that's where you're going to be able to save that journal article and also open it up to be able to get pictures using that snipping tool. You can also use a library search by just putting searching for, if we looked at this everything and drop down, you can search for articles. For the citation, if you have, this will help you with identifying it's the parenthetical or in-text citation. This is the 7th edition. This has whether it's one author, two authors, or three or more authors, and whether the only time that it's different is this is really how you utilize in on your slide. So if there's one author, it's just the name, comma, and the year. If it's, and I don't know, this is a typo. This should say 2020, not 2009 for the subsequent citations. I don't know why it does that. Looks like they put a mistake on there because I just did the snipping tool, and this is what I got. For three or more authors, it's the et al. Okay. And finally, for the full citation, it is done in a way where you have the last name, comma, initial, dot, space, initial, dot, comma, end. So you'll see that if you've got more than one author, it's going to still have that comma. When you get to the very last author, you're going to use that ampersand. The year is going to be after the author's names in a parenthesis with a period. The title of the article, you capitalize only the first word. If you have a colon, you would use typical sentence grammar and make the word after the colon capitalized as well. You end it with a period. The name of the periodical is italicized. It is all in capitalized if it's the major words. So of course of the would not be capitalized, but if it would be International Journal of Nutrition, of would be small, everything else would be capitalized and all italicized. The volume number is italicized. The issue is in parentheses. If there's not an issue number, no big deal, just put a comma. The page numbers are put in, put a period, and then the DOI. And there's no period after that DOI. So that is the 7th edition quick reference guide for a journal article. And so this particular journal article, we were going to practice of what that looked like, and we did that in class.